Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Black Literature, Black History. This is Jason Williams, and tonight we continue with the slave narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs, Chapter 6, entitled The Jealous Mistress. Now, this is a very important chapter in the book, and it's very important that we understand the message that Harriet Jacobs is trying to convey as she entitles this chapter, The Jealous Mistress. Now, this chapter begins with her talking about the continuous sexual advances of her slave master, Dr. Flint, towards her. Now, she says that the mistress noticed his advances because they were getting stronger, and since the mistress was keeping an eye on the slave master a little bit closer, he started to give Harriet Jacobs signals and signs and things like that to try to deceive the mistress. But Harriet Jacobs acts like she didn't understand any of the signs. She tried to act like she was dumb, like a dumb slave. She even talks about the slave master catching her, teaching herself to read. And at first she said he seemed angry about this, but then he turned around and tried to use that as an advantage and started leaving her little notes and things of his intentions. But then she would act like she couldn't read his notes. Now, this is the important part of the chapter. The mistress seems to kind of protect Harriet Jacobs. And Harriet Jacobs makes it clear in this chapter that she wanted protection from the slave master. She wanted protection from the slave master, and she wanted the mistress to protect her, but she knows that she could not get protection from the mistress. And then you wonder, like, how did she not get protection from the mistress? Because throughout this chapter, the slave master, according to what she wrote, the slave master never accomplished his advances to Harriet Jacobs. And it seems that in this chapter that the mistress intervened and kind of saved the day for Harriet Jacobs. Because Harriet Jacobs, she threatens Dr. Flint by saying she's going to tell her grandmother, but then he threatens her and says, with death and things worse than death. So you can imagine whatever it is, maybe that he was going to rape her and kill her, or kill her grandmother, because she said he threatens her with death and things worse than death. And she actually finds refuge from the slave master for a while, sleeping with her aunt, because her aunt was well known in the community, and she refers again to the doctor having a certain status in the community because he was a doctor. So he had to have some type of decency in the eyes of the community. So he didn't want to aggressively just take Harriet Jacobs. So he devised this plan. He argues with his wife. I believe they have a 4-year-old son, and he wants to sleep in the room with his son. And according to some type of rule that they had to have a slave in the room if he's going to sleep with the child in the room. And of course, he selected Harriet Jacobs because he wanted to have the room to himself with the small child, and then have his way with Harriet Jacobs. And through a fight that he had with the mistress, this never took place. Now, from reading this chapter, it seems that the mistress intervened and saved the day for Harriet Jacobs. She says that she expected for the mistress to protect her from the slave master because Harriet Jacobs wanted to protect her virginity. She wanted to protect that, and she would believe that another woman, the mistress, would understand that and protect her from the master. But through a conversation that she has with the mistress, she understands that the mistress's intervention had nothing to do with her compassion for Harriet Jacobs. However, it was about her own pride, her own marriage, and her own. She made herself the victim. The mistress acted like she was the victim, and we see that happening a lot today, where a certain group of people are attacked, and they seek compassion from another group, but the other group looks at themselves as the victim instead of looking at the real group that's the victim. Now you can look at that how you want, but I'm going to read the conversation where Harriet Jacobs realizes that the mistress intervening between the master and her had nothing to do with compassion. And then I'm going to give you some thoughts after this. After a while, my mistress sent for me to come to her room. Her first question was, "Did you know you were to sleep in the doctor's room?" "Yes, ma'am." "Who told you?" "My master." "Will you answer truly all the questions I ask?" "Yes, ma'am." "Tell me, then, as you hope to be forgiven, are you innocent of what I have accused you?" "I am." So Harriet Jacobs is innocent. She handed me a Bible and said, "Lay your hand on your heart, kiss this holy book, and swear before God that you tell me the truth." I took the oath she required, and I did it with a clear conscience. "You have taken God's holy word to testify your innocence," said she. "If you have deceived me, beware. Now take this stool, sit down, look me directly in the face, and tell me all that has passed between your master and you." I did as she ordered. As I went on with my account, her color changed frequently. She wept and sometimes groaned. She spoke in tones so sad that I was touched by her grief. The tears came to my eyes, but I was soon convinced that her emotions arose from anger and wounded pride. She felt that her marriage vows were desecrated, her dignity insulted, but she had no compassion for the poor victim of her husband's perfidy. She pitied herself as a martyr, but she was incapable of feeling for the condition of shame and misery in which her unfortunate, helpless slave was placed. Now, this is the climax of the chapter. She understands that the mistress's intervention had nothing to do with her. Now, how can we use that? We need to understand, as Black people, that when we're looking at politics and when we're looking at situations that are going on where white supremacists are coming up with ideas that we seem to agree with, before saying, "Oh, I agree with that, I'm down with that," like with the issue of immigration or the issues with interracial relationships, however you feel about that, their reasoning behind what their final point is not the same reasons that you have. And you need to understand that. Before you start backing up, say, like Donald Trump, if you feel that he's a good president, I don't, and most people don't, before you start saying, "Oh, I agree with his policies on immigration, I agree with this and that. You have to remember when he was running for president, all those black people that were beat down at his rallies, all of his rhetoric about banning Muslims, all of his rhetoric about Barack Obama. So before you find yourself agreeing with him, remember that he was placing white supremacists in the cabinet and on his staff. And when the white supremacists ran that lady over and killed her, he said there were some good people in that. So when you say, "Oh, I agree with him about building a wall and not letting illegal aliens or whatever you want to call them, undocumented," first you have to understand the issue. But before you start saying I agree with him, you got to know the background and where he's coming from, and understand that your reasoning is not the same, and he's not doing it for compassion for you. Just like Harriet Jacobs, at first she said she felt compassion. I was touched by her grief, but I soon was convinced that her emotions arose from anger and wounded pride. So she actually was angry at Harriet Jacobs for what the master was doing. And this is further shown as you read in the chapter. Harriet Jacobs thought that the mistress was going to kill her because the mistress put Harriet Jacobs in a room beside her, and instead of checking in on the master to see if the master was going to pursue Harriet, the mistress was going in looking over at Harriet Jacobs. And Harriet Jacobs said this was very creepy, and she really thought that the mistress was going to kill her. And she said, imagine waking up in the middle of the night with a white mistress who hates you bending over staring at you. And that's in this chapter. So it's very important to understand that she didn't appreciate this intervention that the mistress had to keep Harriet Jacobs out of that room with the master, because the intentions behind the mistress were different. So you need to understand that before you start agreeing with certain factions of society, because the final outcome seems to be in your favor, you need to know why they're doing it. Because once that final outcome happens, you're back fighting. And then that final outcome is not going to be in your favor. I think about the feminist movement when I read this chapter. And people who support the feminist movement, black women and black men, or just minorities who support the feminist movement, which is run by white women. And minorities and black women listen to the ideals and the outcomes of what the feminist movement is striving for. But are the reasons that these white women have, are they just in line with what minorities or what black women have in mind? And from looking up in history, it's not. It seems that there's a goal that white women want with the numbers and all the support, but in the end, black women don't get anything out of it, or minorities don't get anything out of it. When we look at the civil rights movement, it was disrupted by the feminist movement, causing disruption between the unity between black men and black women. And that's, you can look that up, how the feminist movement did disrupt the civil rights movement. And speaking of the feminist movement, like you can join forces with the feminist movement, and the stuff that I said earlier about Donald Trump, the black people getting beat up at his rallies, him putting a ban on all Muslims, and Muslims is a code word for black people, him constantly questioning Obama, and then his reasonings behind putting a wall up between the U.S. and Mexico to stop immigration from the South. You put all that together, you think about the feminist movement and the Me Too movement and all of this, but you know for a fact, and it's documented, that 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump. Not for Hillary, who is a woman that could have been president, but 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump, which is more than half. More than half of white women in the United States agreed with what they saw of Donald Trump and what they heard come out of his mouth and his ideas. So when you join these movements and you have white women at the head of these movements, you got to make sure that what you're following is in line with what you really want, the reasonings behind it, like Harriet Jacobs talked about, because it may not be. And this is not just an attack on white women, but this is called the jealous mistress. So these slave narratives from Harriet Jacobs is focusing right now on the mistress and her part. And then all the mistresses are white women. So I like to relate what's going on today sometimes and historically in the US with these slave narratives, because the issues are the same in many cases. And people don't evolve that fast. The people who are living during this time period, which is only like 4 generations back, these are the same people, the same needs, the same thoughts, the same genetics as now. We have not evolved into some other species. So don't think that the people of today can't enact and feel the way that the people in these slave narratives felt and acted. And then we go back to the agenda of the slave narratives, which is to convince the North to support the slaves and the women in the slave movement, in the slavery, to have compassion. She talks about the Fugitive Slave Act, and she makes it a point to recognize the horror of the Fugitive Slave Act. And she says, reader, I draw no imaginary pictures of Southern homes. I am telling you the plain truth. Yet, when victims make their escape from this wild beast of slavery, Northerners consent to act the part of bloodhounds and hunt the poor fugitive back to his den, full of dead men's bones and uncleanliness. Nay, more, they are not only willing, but proud to give their daughters in marriage to slaveholders. And then she goes on to talk about the many Southern women marry these slave holders knowing that they have children with these slaves. And this is also an important part of this chapter. She talks about the different kinds of relationships that slave masters have with their children, or the events that take place when slave masters get married and have children with their slaves. So when slave masters get married to a white woman and they have slave babies at the same time. I'm trying to make it clear what I'm trying to say. Now, she says that some slave masters follow the word of their mistress. She says some mistresses are, she said, somehow like compassionate and make their husbands free their slave children to let them go. Some of the mistresses force the slave master to sell those children to get them out of sight because they're a stain on the marriage. The mistress doesn't want to see them. And Frederick Douglass talks about that when he says that many of the mixed children have it harder on the plantation because the hatred of the mistress and just that stain and constant reminder of the adultery of the slave master. And then she said that some of the women have just, what does she say? Though this bad institution deadens the moral sense, even in white women, to a fearful extent, it is not altogether extinct. I have heard Southern ladies say of Mr. Such a One, he not only thinks it no disgrace to be the father of those little niggers, but he is not ashamed to call himself their master. I declare, such things ought not to be tolerated in any decent society. So with this institution of slavery, the Southerners still believe that they have a decent society. But the jealous mistress, and I can also appreciate this chapter because, like I said in a previous video, you know, Harriet Jacobs talks about the mistress, the white women in the institution of slavery and the part that they took and their jealousy and their horror. Because she mentions in here that had it not been for the slave master to make it a rule not to beat or flog Harriet Jacobs, she is 100% sure that the mistress would have done it. However, you know, but she's not going to like give him credit for that because she says he has his reasons for making that rule of not beating her, reasons that aren't concurrent or don't really favor her. So when you're reading this chapter, you know, keep that in mind, what she's trying to convey. It's only good if your reasons are in line with the underdog or the slave's reasons or the minority's reasons, the reasoning behind a certain outcome has to be congruent. That way, if you reach an outcome, the outcome can persist. So this is a very good chapter, The Jealous Mistress. So, and the next chapter we get into is called The Lover, and this is going to be a very interesting chapter, chapter 7. And it starts out, why does the slave ever love? And then she's going to talk about, she's going to answer that question. So this is Jason Williams, Black Literature, Black History. Have a nice evening.